Welcome to a Perspectives editorial. Today we're taking a step back from the daily headlines to look at the bigger picture. Now, we often talk about individual stories of repression or activism, but rarely do we see how they are interconnected in the high-stakes game of global geopolitics. So the question I want to pose today is very simple. Where is the Khalistan movement in the eyes of the world right now? Well, to answer that, we have to look at what I call the grand seduction. This is the desperate attempt by Western powers to pull India into their orbit, and how the variable geometry of the new leadership is changing the path toward a sovereign Sikh state. So for years we've seen the West try to seduce India. Washington, London, Paris are terrified of a world dominated by the BRICS economies and the China-Russia axis. They want India to be their democratic counterweight in Asia, the India-shaped alternative to Chinese manufacturing and Russian energy. But this seduction is hitting a wall of reality. Look at the BRICS naval drills earlier this month. Despite India holding the BRICS chair for 2026, New Delhi notably skipped the joint exercises off the coast of South Africa. Why? Because they're terrified of being seen as part of an anti-Western military bloc, while they're simultaneously begging for US and French fighter jets to wean themselves off Russian dependency. India is of course playing a very dangerous game of strategic autonomy, trying to keep Western money and weapons flowing while refusing to fully commit to Western security interests. So this brings us back to this variable geometry of new leadership that Mark Carney has referred to. In Canada, we have seen a jarring pivot. We went from the Trudeau era, where the Prime Minister stood up in Parliament to expose India's transnational oppression, to the new Carney administration. Even as we speak, Prime Minister Mark Carney is in India meeting with Modi in Mumbai and New Delhi. Now, Carney is a pragmatist. Facing unpredictable trade tariffs from a Trump-led US, he's looking for new markets at any cost. His government is even claiming that the Indian threat is over to somehow justify this trade mission. But the facts on the ground tell a very different story. Just days before Carney landed, as I reported in yesterday's show, Canadian police issued a fourth duty-to-warn letter to activist Maninder Singh, notifying him of a credible threat against his life and, this time, his family. But Carney is choosing dollars over human rights. But the Sikh diaspora isn't letting him off the hook. And what about the United States? Donald Trump is back, and of course he's as unpredictable as ever. In his 2026 State of the Union address, he made the stunning claim that he personally prevented a nuclear war between India and Pakistan back in May 2025 after those Pahalgam attacks. He claimed he saved 35 million lives by threatening massive tariffs and using what he called phone diplomacy. Now, of course, at the time, India denies this. And Trump's willingness to use extreme economic pressure on Modi shows that the seduction can very quickly turn into a shakedown. If Trump decides that India's repression on US soil is indeed an insult to America first, that relationship could fracture overnight. And over here in the UK, the story is just one of quiet betrayal. The Labour government, much like the Conservatives before them, made grand promises to the Sikh community about an independent inquiry into 1984, amongst other promises pre-election. Yet, of course, now that they're in government, there is zero progress. Starmer, like Carney, is embracing Modi in hopes of a trade deal, while the case of Jagtar Singh Johal remains in a state of perpetual discussion with no result. In Australia, Anthony Albanese is playing a similar double game. While he defends the legal right to hold a Khalistan referendum, he simultaneously pledges strict action against activists to keep his trade relationship with India smooth. But here's the analytical hook. The West is trying to buy stability with arms deals, French Rafale jets and US Predators, but they are tethering themselves to a state that is increasingly being labelled a perpetrator of transnational repression. Every trade deal signed while a Sikh activist receives a duty-to-warn letter is basically a ticking time bomb for these Western leaders. They're realising that India isn't the reliable partner that they hoped for. It's a state that brings its domestic conflicts into the streets of Surrey, Birmingham, New York. This variable geometry creates an opening. As the West realises that India's internal repression makes it an unstable ally, the argument for a sovereign, democratic Khalistan as a regional buffer becomes more than just a sick dream. It becomes a geopolitical necessity. While Western capitals are entangled in the variable geometry of trade and military deals, the Khalistan movement is quietly achieving something India's intelligence agencies never anticipated. It's actually winning this narrative war on the global stage. The movement is no longer being discussed as a fringe security issue. It's now being framed as a democratic struggle for self-determination against a state increasingly defined globally by its own lawlessness. And the most visible engine of this shift is, of course, the Khalistan referendum. And despite India's relentless diplomatic pressure and local bans, the sheer scale of voter turnout is undeniable. In 2024 and 2025, we saw history made across the West. In San Francisco, over 127,000 American Sikhs cast their ballots in early 2024. That momentum rolled into Canada, over 53,000 voting in Calgary in July 2024, followed by another massive turnout of over 53,000 in Ottawa in November last year. But the referendum isn't just about the numbers, it's about legitimacy. By using an independent international committee of scholars to oversee the balloting, Sikhs for Justice has transformed the campaign into a preview of transnational direct democracy. The ultimate goal remains clear. Use this global consensus to force a UN-supervised official referendum within Punjab. And with support in Punjab clearly present, symbolised, for example, by the election of figures like Amritpal Singh, the question isn't if the referendum will go to Punjab, but when the international community will have the courage to support it. And beyond the ballot box, the movement is taking its case to the highest diplomatic levels. The Global Khalistani Conference, recently held in Azerbaijan back last month, was a watershed moment. By moving the dialogue to Baku, a non-Western strategically positioned nation, activists executed a triple threat manoeuvre: ideological messaging, international networking, and the use of foreign platforms that New Delhi cannot easily bully. And this has forced Indian analysts to admit that the Khalistani ecosystem is evolving into a sophisticated global network that challenges India's diplomatic interests simultaneously on multiple continents. Equally critical is the reorganisation of the Sikh Federation UK. On its 40th anniversary, in late 2024, the Federation moved to a Panj Padani collective leadership system, led, of course, by British-born Sikh professionals. Now, their strategy is surgical. They are pushing Western governments to officially declare India a rogue state. They're using the evidence of the last 2 years, the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, the full plot against Gurpatant Singh Pannu in the US, to prove that India has transitioned from a strategic partner to a perpetrator of transnational repression. Now, this term, transnational repression, is now the movement's most powerful weapon in the propaganda war. Mainstream Western media, from the Washington Post to the Guardian here in the UK, are no longer just repeating New Delhi's talking points. They're actually now investigating how Indian agents intimidate, harass and target Sikh citizens here on Western soil. In California, a landmark anti-intimidation bill was introduced in 2025 specifically to train law enforcement on how to recognise and respond to these foreign hits on diaspora communities. Now, the narrative is now shifting. India's efforts to label Khalistanis as terrorists is failing because the world is seeing the Indian state itself linked to criminal gangs and extrajudicial killings. So as the West wakes up to the reality that India is bringing its violence to our streets, the argument for Khalistan changes. It's no longer just about Sikh rights. It's about Western sovereignty. If the West wants to stop Indian repression, the most logical solution is to support the creation of a sovereign state that finally settles the Punjab question through the very democratic values the West claims to uphold. Now, as we've seen throughout today's analysis, the global geopolitical map is being redrawn. And for the first time in decades, the lines of that map are pointing toward a fundamental change in the Indian subcontinent. The West's attempt to use India as a singular counterweight to China is faltering because India's internal Hindutva-driven radicalisation and its external transnational repression make it a liability, not an asset. And this instability creates a vacuum that only one solution can fill: a sovereign, democratic Khalistan. So what is the path forward? Well, based on the shifting dynamics that we've discussed, there are two primary routes to establishing Khalistan. Firstly, we have the buffer state geopolitical realignment. For the Western military and economic complex, a sovereign Khalistan is no longer just a human rights issue. It is basically a strategic necessity. Currently, the border between nuclear-armed India and Pakistan is a constant flashpoint of global tension. A sovereign Khalistan would serve as the perfect regional buffer state, de-escalating the direct friction between these two warring nations, while of course acting as a Western-aligned democratic beachhead in the heart of South Asia. Much like the variable geometry sought by leaders like Ghani, a sovereign Punjab provides a stable, reliable partner that is not beholden to the erratic shifts of a Hindutva-driven New Delhi. And secondly, we have the international recognition scenario. So the path to statehood often begins with the delegitimisation of the oppressor. And we're seeing this now, as Sikh diaspora organisations from the Sikh Federation to Sikhs for Justice successfully push Western governments to recognise India's actions as state-sponsored terrorism on foreign soil. As more nations document India's weaponisation of its laws and criminal gangs against the Sikh Panth, the moral and legal authority of the Indian state over Punjab diminishes. The continued success of the referendum proves that the democratic will of the people exists. It's only a matter of time before the West realises that supporting a sovereign Khalistan is the only way to protect their own sovereignty from Indian interference. The grand seduction of India by the West is basically failing because the price of the partnership is just too high. It requires the West to turn a blind eye to the murder of its own citizens and the erosion of its democratic values. The ingredients for Khalistan are now all on the table: a mobilised and professionalised diaspora, a clear record of Indian state failure, and a global need for a reliable democratic buffer in the region. The path forward is not just through activism, but through the incisive analysis of these global shifts. We must continue to inform, to educate, and to prove to the world that a sovereign Khalistan isn't just a dream for Sikhs. It is the key to a stable and just global order. The landscape's changing, the truth is emerging, and the path to Khalistan has never been clearer. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.